LiSTNR production.
Brisbane, October 20, 1989. A Friday night, and a gruesome crime that would captivate and horrify Australia for all the wrong reasons. 47-year-old Edward Clyde Baldock was a council worker, father of 5, and grandfather. He staggered drunkenly along O'Connell Street in Kangaroo Point after a night of drinking and darts at the Caledonian Club. It was close to midnight when a green Holden Commodore pulled up beside him, carrying 4 women whose actions that night would earn them infamy as the Brisbane Vampire Killers. At the centre of this gruesome tale is Tracey Wigginton, a 24-year-old factory worker who lured Baldock into the car and set in motion a chain of events that ended in his brutal murder. I'm Dan Mullins. This is Crime Insider's Judgement, a deep dive on a judge's final verdict of a crime and what transpired to incite that judgment. In this episode of Crime Insider's Judgement, the crime, the individuals involved, the trial, and the lasting impact of a case described as one of Australia's most brutal and bizarre. Edward Baldock was an unassuming man, slight, balding, and known for his kindness. That Friday night, after leaving the Caledonian Club, he was heavily intoxicated, clinging to lampposts for support, hoping to hail a cab to take him home. His vulnerability made him an easy target for Tracey Wigginton, who, along with her lover Lisa Pachinski and friends Kim Jarvis and Tracy Waugh, had been prowling Brisbane in search of a victim. Wigginton, a towering figure at 183 centimetres and 95 kilograms, with dark hair and intense eyes, was driven by a volatile mix of rage and a self-proclaimed vampiric need to feed. Earlier that evening, the group had been drinking Riccadonna Spumante at L'Amour's, a nightclub in Fortitude Valley, where Wigginton's simmering anger, fueled by jealousy over a lover's wandering eye, reached boiling point. Spotting Baldock, Wigginton called out to him from the car. Though accounts differ on whether she offered him a lift or posed as a prostitute promising sex, Baldock, too intoxicated to resist, climbed into the back seat and promptly fell asleep. Wigginton directed Pachinski to drive to Orley Park, a secluded spot along the Brisbane River in West End, near a rowing shed and a sailing club. The group's intentions were unspoken but understood. Wigginton had found her prey. At Orley Park, Pachinski led Baldock to the riverbank while Wigginton retrieved a weapon. Baldock, perhaps unaware of the danger, stripped to his socks and neatly folded his clothes, suggesting he anticipated something consensual. Wigginton returned with a silver ninja butterfly knife borrowed from Jarvis, originally carried for protection. Approaching Baldock from behind, Wigginton stabbed him in the back without a word. As he struggled, grabbing at her hand, she plunged the knife into his neck, then pulled his head back by the hair and slashed his throat. What followed was a frenzied attack, 27 stab wounds in total, nearly decapitating him. Pachinski later likened it to a shark's feeding frenzy, a description that captured the ferocity of Wigginton's assault. After the killing, Wigginton smoked a cigarette, watching Baldock die with chilling detachment, later admitting she felt nothing. She drank his blood, fulfilling her vampiric fantasy as he made a gargling sound, blood spilling from his mouth. Pachinski returned to the car. Wigginton washed herself and the knives in the river. 15 minutes later, Wigginton rejoined the group, inviting the others to go down to the river to see the body. They drove off, and Tracey Ward would later tell her trial she smelt blood on Wigginton's breath. Wigginton soon realised she'd left her Commonwealth Bank keycard behind. Returning before dawn to search for it, she couldn't find it. She knew she'd somehow left incriminating evidence behind. The next morning, a rower stumbled upon Baldock's naked body, riddled with stab wounds, puncture marks on his back and shoulders, severed arteries in his neck. His autopsy revealed fingers had been pushed into some wounds, suggesting a grotesque exploration of the carnage. Police found Baldock's wallet with $35 cash in it, stuffed under the Sailing Club door, and, inside of one of his shoes, Wigginton's bank keycard. The court later heard it could have been one of the other women who placed the card in Baldock's shoe, perhaps a plant to indicate who committed the murder. Or it could have been Baldock himself who somehow found the card and put it in his shoe before being attacked. One of the investigating officers, Senior Sergeant Pat Glancy, later said, he, by putting it up into his shoe, helped us solve his murder. It was just an unbelievable clue. When detectives later knocked on the door of her flat across town at Enoggera, Wigginton claimed she'd been near the river but knew nothing of the murder. Initially, police struggled to believe anyone could commit such savagery, but her story unravelled. When police searched Wigginton's car, they found a bloody towel she had used to wipe away excess blood. Pachinski, meantime, had told friends what had transpired on that Friday night. They urged her to go to the police, which she did. By day's end, on Monday, October 23, 1989, all four women were in custody, charged with Baldock's murder. Born August 4, 1965 in Rockhampton, Wigginton's life was marked by instability and trauma. Adopted by her biological mother Rhonda Hopkins' adoptive parents, George and Avril Wigginton, she claimed to have endured physical and sexual abuse in a nightmarish childhood. George Wigginton, a self-made millionaire through his earth-moving business and an influential figure in Rockhampton, so much so that the local council named a street after him, sexually abused Tracey for several years. Avril Wigginton, his wife, was physically violent, repeatedly flogging Tracey with the cord of a clothes iron. Tracey claimed her grandparents were heavily involved in the occult. Family friends later told media outlets Avril detested her husband and lavished attention on their pet chihuahuas while often screaming abuse at Tracey. As a teenager, Tracey attended a prestigious private girls' school where her interests included playing the organ and ballroom dancing. During her trial, experts gave testimony that Tracey suffered from multiple personality disorder. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Donald Grant identified about 5 distinct personalities within Tracey's mind, with 2 deemed capable of committing the murder. These personalities included Little Tracey, a childlike, innocent personality; Big Tracey, a woman with severe depression; The Observer, a disconnected, icy personality; Bobby, a frightening and brutal person; and Avril, the reincarnation of Tracey's menacing grandmother. Bobby and Avril were considered the most likely personalities to have taken control of Tracey's mind at the time of the murder. Dr. Grant interviewed Wigginton in prison ahead of her trial. He said, "She said that her anger took a long while to build up, but that when it boiled over, she completely lost control. As she told me about her violent episodes, about what she had done to people, I detected a hint of relish. I thought this indicated a degree of sadism. In killing poor Edward Baldock, Tracey took revenge on all her past abusers. To understand the distinctions between Tracey's multiple personalities, she underwent hypnosis. Dr. Chris Clark, a psychologist from the University of New South Wales, recounted how Tracey's face transformed when asked to describe the moment she saw her victim. Adopting the voice of Bobby and growling, she said, "I want him." Multiple personality disorder, known as dissociative identity disorder, arises from extreme trauma, such as child abuse. It serves as a coping mechanism, allowing individuals to distance themselves from their own personality by creating new ones. This enables them to believe that their historic events happened to someone else. The existence of the disorder and whether it was a mitigating influence on Tracey's behaviour that night on October 1989 was debated during her trial, with the prosecution presenting a psychiatrist who believed it was a fabrication. A book, published some years after the murders, delved into Tracey's background. The Vampire Killer, by Ron Hicks, told the story of Avril's childhood, Tracey's grandmother. Avril was sexually abused by an uncle at the age of 11 after the parents' marriage dissolved. As a teenager, Avril was beaten with a bottle, raped by a family friend. Avril married George Whittington in the late 1930s, but was unable to conceive. They adopted 2 daughters, Rhonda and Doral, who later described the dreadful home environment they endured. Avril was a fierce and violent disciplinarian. George eventually moved out, while Avril unofficially adopted an intellectually disabled girl, Mary, and later Tracey's half-sister Michelle, the unwanted child of a friend of Rhonda's. In the mid-1960s, Rhonda married a local painter and had Tracey 5 years later. The marriage ended, and Avril became deeply involved in Tracey's life. Rhonda moved away, and Tracey remained with Avril and the half-sister Michelle. Avril legally adopted Tracey by the time she was 3. Avril started drinking heavily and would beat Michelle. She had male friends visit who would also beat Michelle, often in front of Tracey. Their lives cascaded into violence and abuse, triggering Tracey's multiple personality disorders. Michelle managed to escape Avril's control at 15. After the murder, Michelle expressed regret for not taking Tracey with her when she left. After accusing her grandparents of being involved in the occult, in her teens, Wigginton too became obsessed with the black arts. George died in 1979. Avril died 2 years later. After their deaths in 1981, she inherited $75,000 at 15 and briefly returned to her mother, Rhonda Hopkins, who disapproved of her lesbianism. Wigginton later lived with a family friend, Kay Worry, who described her as a loving, artistic Catholic girl. But by 1982, she'd transformed, cutting her hair short, adopting the alter ego Bobby, and marrying a woman named Sunshine in a Hare Krishna ceremony in Cairns. Wigginton's descent into darkness accelerated. She worked as a bouncer and briefly as a prostitute, sought a man to impregnate her, miscarrying the child, and abandoned her previous religious beliefs for witchcraft. She inherited another $80,000 when she turned 21, but spent it quickly and recklessly as she had the first $75,000. Moving to Brisbane, she lived with a lover in Enoggera, adopting another alter ego, Fred, and collecting occult items like tarot cards and animal bones. In the week before the murder, she sharpened knives. Hours before, she watched a violent video fixating on a head-exploding scene. Her rage, rooted in childhood trauma and a lover's infidelity, erupted on that fateful Friday night in October 1989. In her police interview a few days after the attack, Wigginton said,
"I walked around behind him. I took my knife out of my back pocket. He asked me what I was doing. I said nothing and stabbed him. He went up to grab my hand. I pushed his hand down, withdrew the knife and stabbed him in the side of the neck. I stabbed him in the other side of the neck and I continuously stabbed him. I then grabbed him by the hair on his head and pulled back, stabbed him in the front of the throat, and at that stage, he was still alive."
After watching Baldock die, she went down to the river to wash the knife, her hands and arms. Let's look at the others with Wigginton that night. Lisa Ptaschinski. Wigginton's lover, Lisa Ptaschinski, was a deeply troubled 24-year-old with a history of 80 hospitalizations over 5 years for self-harm and drug overdoses. Meeting Wigginton 2 weeks earlier, she quickly fell into an affair despite Wigginton's existing relationship. Ptaschinski's instability made her a malleable follower. Wigginton even convinced her to slit her veins for blood-drinking rituals. At Ptaschinski's trial, police prosecutor Adrian Gundelach recounted how Ptaschinski told police Wigginton used to put a tourniquet around Ptaschinski's wrist, pump up her vein, and make a small cut. Gundelach said as blood was coming out, Wigginton would suck it with her mouth. Ptaschinski told a psychiatrist who gave evidence at the trial, "If you're going out with someone, you do whatever you can to please them." On the night of the murder, she drove the car and led Baldock to the river, witnessing the killing up close. 23-year-old Kim Jarvis was Wigginton's disciple in a supposed satanic cult. Once a doll collector with aspirations of becoming a nun, Jarvis was transformed by Wigginton's influence. After breaking a crucifix necklace, she was dubbed as a chosen one and destroyer in Wigginton's witches' circle, believing Wigginton could rip arms off foes. Jarvis supplied the butterfly knife and viewed Baldock's body post-murder, cementing her complicity. Her lover, Tracey Wigginton, was also drawn into the group, though less willingly. Wigginton was a shy, 23-year-old former Catholic private schoolgirl. Although she was there that night as Jarvis's lover, she was the least culpable. She believed Wigginton was the devil's bride, telepathic, and capable of vanishing, leaving only cat's eyes. Despite her fear, Wigginton stayed in the car during the murder, later testifying she tried to stop Jarvis from participating. Her reduced role in the murder spared her conviction. Coming up, the trial that became a national sensation. On February 1st, 1990, the 4 women were committed for trial in Queensland's Supreme Court. Wigginton pleaded guilty, revelling in her notoriety. She was heard to say to media during the trial, "It's hard to be famous, isn't it? A legend in my own mind." The others pleaded not guilty, facing a 14-day trial that gripped the nation. The courtroom overflowed, and the world's media packed into the courtroom and surrounds. Newspaper headlines at the time read, "Lesbian vampire killer lured man with a promise of sex before killing him for his blood." And "Killer was devil's wife with power to control minds." Ptaschinski was convicted of murder after 48 hours of jury deliberation and sentenced to life. She was released in 2008 and is kept out of the media spotlight ever since. Even though she had not killed or been involved in the killing, she had led Baldock to the river and supplied the murder weapon. Jarvis was convicted of manslaughter and received an 18-year sentence, later reduced to 12 on appeal. She was released after 12 years. A critical aspect of the court's finding was that after the murder, Wigginton invited the other three to go down to the riverbank to see the body. Only Pachinski and Jarvis did so. War, who remained in the car the whole time, was acquitted, deemed uninvolved. She walked free from the court on the day of the verdict. Wigginton was also sentenced to life with a minimum of 13 years. After assaulting a guard and inmate in prison in 2006, she faced repeated parole denials until her release on January 11, 2012, after serving 22 years. In a 1996 Courier Mail interview, she described the murder as a release of repressed rage, calling it terrifying and playing God. Her mother, Rhonda Hopkins, denied the vampirism claims in 1991, insisting Tracey was a loving, good-natured girl, undone by Brisbane's lesbian community. Wigginton kept a low profile until 2019, when Facebook posts under an alter ego's name featured vampires, skulls and cannibalistic jests, revived public fear. She was back in the media spotlight, with Nine's A Current Affair running a story about her and two detectives involved in her murder conviction telling the show she should never have been released from prison. Edward Baldock's daughter, Tracey, told Nine News at the time that Wigginton should have remained imprisoned forever. During her years in prison, Wigginton wrote to Baldock's family.
I have served 19 years of a life sentence, and not a day has gone by that I don't think about the terrible thing I have done and the pain I have caused you. I know that no amount of wishing or dreaming can bring Mr. Baldock back, but by God I do. I would give anything to change what happened and to save you all the heartache, pain, confusion, and anger that I have caused.
The Brisbane vampire killer's case remains a chilling chapter in Australian crime history. Tracey Wigginton's transformation from a troubled child to a self-styled vampire, her manipulation of vulnerable accomplices, and the savage murder of Edward Baldock reflect a confluence of trauma, delusion, and violence. Thanks for listening to Crime Insider's Judgements. We love hearing your feedback, so please rate and review this episode. If you have a case you want us to cover, let us know via Instagram at LiSTNR Crime or TikTok at LiSTNR Crime Team. I'll be back again next Thursday with another case. I'm Dan Mullins. Thanks for listening. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.